What's your name? I no longer have a name, the strange guest replied with gloomy disdain. I gave it up, just as I've given up everything else in life. Let's drop the subject. Well, then at least tell me about your novel, requested Yvonne tactfully. By all means. My life has turned out to be anything but ordinary, if I do say so myself, the guest began. A historian by training, he had worked until 2 years ago at one of the Moscow museums and had also done translations. From what language? Yvonne inquired with interest. I know 5 languages besides my own, answered the guest. English, French, German, Latin, and Greek. And I also read a little Italian. Wow, whispered Yvonne with envy. The historian had lived a solitary life. He had no family anywhere and virtually no friends in Moscow. And then, imagine, one day he won 100,000 rubles. You can imagine my surprise, whispered the guest in the black cap, when I rummaged around in the dirty laundry basket and found out I had the same number that was printed in the paper. A ticket given at the museum, he explained. After winning 100,000, Yvonne's mysterious guest did the following. He bought some books, moved out of his room on Myasnitskaya Street. Ugh, what a damned hole that was, snarled the guest. He rented 2 rooms from a private home builder in the basement of a small house and a garden on a small street near the Arbat. He quit his job at the museum and began to write a novel about Pontius Pilate. Ah, that was a golden age, the narrator whispered, his eyes shining. It was a completely private apartment with its own entrance and a sink with running water, he emphasized with particular pride for some reason, and small windows looking out over the path leading to the gate. Just opposite, in front of the fence, not more than 4 steps away, there were lilac bushes, a linden tree, and a maple. Once in a while in winter, I'd see someone's black feet through the window, and I'd hear the snow crunching as they walked by. And there was always a fire burning in my stove. But then spring came suddenly, and through the dim glass I saw the lilac branches, which had first been bare, now dressed in green. And then, last spring, something happened that was far more entrancing than winning 100,000 rubles. And that, you will agree, is a huge sum of money. Yes, it is, agreed Yvonne, who was listening attentively. I had opened the window and was sitting in the second and tinier of the 2 rooms. The guest used his hands to illustrate. A couch, and across from it, another couch, and between them a small table with a beautiful night lamp on it. And closer to the window, books. Here, a small desk, and in the first room, an enormous room, 14 square meters. Books, more books, and a stove. Oh, what a great place I had. The smell of the lilacs was extraordinary, and I was becoming lightheaded from exhaustion. And Pilate was flying to an end? White cloak, blood-red lining. I understand, exclaimed Yvonne. Exactly. Pilate was flying to an end, and I already knew that the last words of the novel would be, the 5th procurator of Judea, the knight, Pontius Pilate. Well, naturally, I'd go for walks. 100,000 is a huge sum, and I had a handsome suit. Or I'd dine at some inexpensive restaurant. There was a marvelous restaurant on the Arbat. I don't know if it's still there. Here the guest's eyes opened wide, and he continued whispering as he gazed at the moon. She was carrying some hideous, disturbing yellow flowers. The devil only knows what they're called. But for some reason, they are the first ones to bloom in Moscow, and those flowers stood out very distinctly against her black spring coat. She was carrying yellow flowers, a bad color. She turned off Tverskaya into a side street and then looked back. Do you know Tverskaya? Thousands of people were walking along Tverskaya, but I assure you, she saw only me, and she gave me a look that was not merely anxious, but even pained. And I was struck, not so much by her beauty, as by the extraordinary, incomparable loneliness in her eyes. Obeying that yellow sign, I, too, turned into the side street and followed her. We walked silently along the dull, winding lane. I on one side, and she on the other. And imagine, there wasn't a soul in the street. I was in torment because I felt that I had to talk to her. And I was afraid I wouldn't be able to utter a word, and she would go away, and I would never see her again. And then, imagine, she said, unexpectedly, "Do you like my flowers?" I distinctly remember the sound of her voice, rather low, but halting, and however silly this may seem, I felt that an echo sounded in the lane and reverberated off the dirty yellow wall. I quickly crossed over to her side of the street and, walking up to her, replied, "No." She looked at me with surprise, and I suddenly and completely unexpectedly realized that this was the woman I had loved my whole life. Amazing, isn't it? Naturally, you'll say I'm a madman, right? "I'm not saying anything," Yvonne exclaimed, adding, "Please go on." And the guest continued. Yes, she gave me a look of surprise, and then she asked, "Is it that you just don't like flowers?" I thought I detected hostility in her voice. I walked alongside her, trying to keep in step with her, and to my surprise, I felt no constraint whatsoever. "No, I like flowers, but not those," I said. "What kind do you like?" "I like roses." Then I regretted having said that because she smiled guiltily and threw her flowers into the gutter. A bit flustered, I retrieved them nonetheless and handed them back to her, but she pushed them away with a smile, and I ended up carrying them. Thus, we walked in silence for a while until she took the flowers out of my hand and threw them on the pavement. Then she put her hand in a flared black glove through my arm, and we walked off together. "Go on," said Yvonne, "and please don't leave anything out." "Go on?" the guest echoed. "Well, you yourself can guess what happened next." Suddenly, he wiped away an unexpected tear with his right sleeve and continued, "Just like a murderer jumps out of nowhere in an alley, love jumped out in front of us and struck us both at once. The way lightning strikes, or a Finnish knife." She, by the way, would later say that it wasn't like that we had, of course, loved each other for a very long time without knowing or ever having seen each other, and that she was living with another man. And I was then with that... What's her name? "With whom?" asked Bezdomny. With that... Well, the guest answered, snapping his fingers. "You were married?" "Well, yes, that's why I'm snapping my fingers. To that... Varinka, Varinka, with the striped dress at the museum, but I can't remember." And so she used to say that she had gone out that day carrying the yellow flowers so that I would at last find her. And that if it hadn't happened, she would have poisoned herself because her life was empty. Yes, love struck us instantly. I knew it that very day, an hour later, when we lost track of where we were and found ourselves on the embankment by the Kremlin wall. We talked as if we had parted only the day before, as if we had known each other for many years. We agreed to meet the next day on the same spot by the Moscow River, and we did. The May sun was shining for us, and very, very soon afterwards, that woman became my secret wife. She would come to me every day, and from morning on I'd start waiting for her. My impatience expressed itself in the way I endlessly rearranged the things on my table. 10 minutes before she arrived, I would sit by the window and start listening for the creaking sound of the decrepit gate. And, oddly, before I met her, hardly anyone, in fact no one, ever visited our little yard. But now it seemed that the whole city was beating a path to our door. The gate would creak, my heart would jump, and imagine, I'd look through the window, and there, level with my head, I'd see a pair of dirty boots. A knife grinder. Who in my house would need a knife grinder? What was there to sharpen? What sort of knives? She would come through the gate only once, but until that happened, my heart would suffer at least 10 palpitations. I'm not lying. And then when it was time for her arrival and the hands were pointing to noon, my heart wouldn't stop pounding until her shoes, noiselessly, without tapping, with their black suede bows and steel buckles, drew level with the window. Sometimes she'd play games and stop at the second window and tap her toe against the glass. I'd be at the window in a second, only to find that the shoes had disappeared long ago, along with the black silk dress that blocked the sun, and I'd go and let her in. Nobody knew about our affair, I can swear to that, although that rarely happens. Her husband didn't know, and neither did her friends. Of course, the people in the old house where my basement apartment was knew. They could see a woman was coming to visit me, but they did not know her name. And what was her name? Asked Yvonne, who was totally mesmerized by the love story. The guest made a gesture indicating that he would never tell anyone her name, and went on with his story. Yvonne learned that the master and the unknown woman fell in love so intensely that they became absolutely inseparable. Yvonne could clearly visualize the 2 rooms in the basement apartment, where it was always twilight because of the lilacs in the fence, the shabby red furniture, the writing desk with a clock on it that chimed every half hour, and the books that went from the painted floor to the soot-covered ceiling, and the stove